and welcome to another video helping you knit the mystery gnome for winter 2020. In this gnome we have done our ear flap and our brim, and we've started the color work. As part of the beginning of the hat, we have changed the beginning of round marker. So the brim we just did for a little while, but before we started the color work, we changed the beginning of round marker to here, which is the back half of the back stitches. So when you fold it in half, you'll notice that it is longer at the back and shorter at the front, and that's on purpose. Now that I've worked a little bit of color work, we can do a little bit of talking. So I have knit the chart 1 and I am now on chart 2. What I want to show you and talk about are a few tips for getting color work to really pop. Part of that is making sure that the color contrast is really high. So that's a big part of color work. Another thing that you need to know about color work is that there are a few tricks. Now, because I've designed this to be knit in bands for a while, so there's we will be knitting with one background color and then we switch, which is the background color and which is the accent color. What we need to do on the second round after each color, we'll knit all the way across in the new color. And then on the second round, we're going to slip the first stitch. So in this row or column of stitches, this stitch will always be this column will always be one stitch shorter in any one band. There's 1, 2, 3 stitches, and here there's 1, 2 stitches. So that's because I slipped this when I was working the second round. So what are some tricks about working with color work? Well, one of the things is that you want the floats, those are these things back here, the color we're not using, we don't want them to change the tension of the yarn and the fabric. So if this was really short, it would be causing things to pucker, and then we wouldn't be able to get these blue stitches to lay down flat and to relax. So we need to make sure that when we look at the fabric, the distance that the float travels is the same as the distance that the stitches travel. And ideally, not the stitches when they're all bunched up on the needle, but sort of the stitches the way they would be when they're flat and relaxed. So one of the tricks for that is to knit a little while and then to sort of stretch your stitches out so you'll be knitting onto this needle and then stop and kind of stretch them out and see if there's any place where there's a real source of tension. Another trick when you're knitting with color work, especially smaller circumference color work, is these sections where the floats travel across corners. So you really have to be careful that this float is long enough, but also that this float is long enough. You can see how much less space that travels. Now, the reason this one's so puffy is because I've been playing with it and pulling on it. It was originally more like this, so that when I checked the float here, if you look, I can bend it and it follows the same amount of distance as the stitches. So that's where longer floats like this, where there's 5 stitches between, it just pays a lot of, there's a real payoff to making sure that your floats are the same distance. Another thing that makes a big difference is something called yarn dominance. So whatever color the motif is in, so for instance in this one it would be the dark one, and in this band, it will of course be the light one. We want that to pop because that's what's going to make the design. There is something we can do to sort of make that stitch have a little more presence, and that's often called yarn dominance because we want it to be the dominant yarn in this particular motif. And the trick for that is to make sure that that color is the one that comes under the other color. So if you think about it, if I start, let's say, here and I go down and over here, I will have traveled farther than if I start here and I go across. So whatever yarn comes from lower is going to be having a little more yarn and therefore have a little more yarn to give to each stitch. They plump up a little bit more rather than disappearing behind the plumpness of the other stitches. So for me, because I knit using 2 hands, that means that whatever color I want the accent to be, the strong dominant one, I knit in my left hand because when I'm throwing, I'm always going over. If you want to hold your yarns so that you are knitting holding both of them in one hand, you can do that. You can pick them up and drop them. So you could, for instance, let's say I start working chart number 2 here. I'm on row, well, I can't remember what row it is, but it's the row where I knit 2 in blue. I could drop this and pick up the white, and I could knit my 3 in white. And after I knit my second one, it's a good time to see if I traveled that corner with enough yarn. It looks a little snug, so I'll pull on it. So I traveled that corner, knit 3 in white, and then I could drop this. And so you don't have to do fancy knitting. If you need to pick up and drop every time, that is absolutely something you can do. If you're going to be knitting, holding 2 yarns, you're going to need to be able to pick and throw. I am not so good at throwing, but for color work, I am getting better. So the color that I want to be the accent color is here on my left, the background color is here on my right, and I simply work my stitch pattern. And again, I check every now and then, I sort of stretch it out and I see, is this float too tight for what's going on there? It seems okay. Then I will do the next one and float around. Even though there's going to be sections in the charts where you work 2 colors and then you switch to just working 1 color, I want to make a note that you don't need to break the yarn. I knit the whole first version of this gnome without breaking the yarn all the way up the hat, and then you don't have extra ends to sew in. So just let it carry up the back of the yarn. What will happen is, where's my back of yarn, or back of the hat beginning around marker here. You can see that just there, it traveled up. And again, you want to make sure that when you start using that color again, you don't have it too snug so that these rounds compress. You don't want that happening. All right, so just when you start using the color again, just make sure that you've left enough space to make up the difference there. I hope that these few tricks help you. If you are really struggling to get the color work to be the same gauge as the rest of your yarn, you can switch which needle size you use for color work versus the ones that you've used for the stockinette. Be aware that color work is something that will need blocking. Right now this looks pretty flat and it's not so bad, but after I knit for a while, often my color work, it looks pretty lumpy and bumpy and it just doesn't have that beautiful smoothness. But as soon as I steam it, as soon as I let it hit some water, everything relaxes, the tension eases out. So don't judge too harshly, but do, maybe if this is your first or second time doing color work, do a little swatch, throw it in the bath, see what happens when it hits the water, how your tension is. Like I said, you can change needle sizes. You can also knit inside out, because what's happening then is rather than traveling, just let me deal with all my ends here. When you look at the circle, that is our yarn and our project, the inside of a circle is smaller than the outside of a circle. So if our yarn is traveling in here, like it was when I was knitting and showing you, that's going to have less yarn to travel. Whereas going around the outside gives things a little bit more. And so all you do, this may seem weird, you're not going to be working on the wrong side, you're still going to be working on the right side. It's just this needle back here. So when we knit normally on the round, we sort of have a flat needle and then the points coming away from us. Whereas if we're knitting in the round inside out, we would have the point coming towards us and we would be knitting across this. So I could, let me just get my yarns in the right hands here. So I've knit 1 blue, so I need to knit 2 more blue. Let me just get going here. So I've got 1, and right at the corner of all these needles, it gets a little like wrestling a hedgehog here a bit. So I've knit 2, and then I'll go 1, 2, 3. And so you can see I'm knitting, I'm not purling, I'm not worried about working on the wrong side. I'm still working on the right side, but my floats are traveling around the outside of the circle and therefore are taking up a little more space. So that is one possibility, as well as changing your needle size if you're having a lot of problems. But the good news is this is a gnome and not a sweater. So if this is a place for you to learn about tension and getting things perfect isn't as important, because it doesn't have to fit you, it doesn't have to fit your best friend or your best friend's baby. It just has to be a gnome. And I guarantee that even if your color work is lumpy and bumpy, you are going to end up with a gnome who will be whimsical and well-loved. So I hope these tricks and ideas have helped you. I wish you happy knitting for the rest of the Colourwork charts, and I'll see you in a couple of clues.